this is a chicken and egg problem. It's an interesting conversations that I've had with a number of doctors where they say like, well, this you shouldn't do this because we don't know the answer. It's like, well, we don't know because we can't measure it. So if your argument is we shouldn't measure it because we don't know what's going to happen, like then we're never going to know. So
Right.
it's a tricky situation.
It's a bit of circular reasoning. We have to develop the capability, the core capability of just measuring these things in order that we can eventually understand what those measurements mean.
So the topic is on biological observability. I think the goal is really to explain to our team what it is and why it matters, and why it's such an important concept for us in the future.
Mhm.
I think that one of the things that comes to mind for me is how uh, glucose is a very interesting molecule to measure. Um, I would even maybe argue that it is if you could measure all the molecules, it might even be the one that is the plurality of what is interesting, but that might only end up being 10% of what you actually want to measure because there are so many molecules. So, like, if we're being super generous to glucose, it's 10% of what you want to know. It's important. It's the primary energy substrate of your body. It's
Mhm.
the reason, well, it is the proximate cause of why people feel awful after they eat a bunch of sugar. Um, so it has lifestyle effects. It certainly affects my mental clarity. I notice that it's a really easy thing to notice when I'm trying to get work done throughout the day. I have these wicked crashes from eating. It used to just be oatmeal,
Right.
but um, so the concept of biological observability is what are the other things you need to be able to measure to understand your body's state, and it's remarkable how little we actually know about our bodies in general. Uh, we know so much about mechanical systems, and I would say the only things that we can measure in real time are basically glucose and heart rate. Is that basically it?
Yeah, I mean, we have with the current wearables, you've got glucose, heart rate. Heart rate variability is kind of a newer one on the scene, and then maybe you can kind of measure pulse oxygen, like my Garmin does some SpO2 stuff, but it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think to your point, we know a lot about every tool we've ever built because we've designed those machines from the ground up, and we've recognized that if we want to control them, we need to understand them. There's a whole science around fault detection, isolation, recovery. So it's called FITR, but uh, this is all about essentially the underpinnings of understanding in real time the state of a machine and detecting when something's going wrong, isolating it and responding to it so that the machine doesn't fail. And we have this whole broad science that covers literally every I would say every industrialized process that has machine elements in it has some sort of fault detection involved that is automated and people are paying attention to it. And the human body is the most complex machine that can't fail, and we have no such thing. We actually only have the R part of that, which is the response or the recovery.
Yeah, and you have the response, but you don't necessarily know what it's a response to.
Right. There's like a forensic process involved where you have to like do the Sherlock Holmes, connect the dots without all of the information, and try and guess what
Yeah,
the source of the fault was.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I wonder in the context of mechanical systems, I've never really worked in. Is there an equation for how rapidly the usefulness of real time information degrades in terms of control systems? Imagine it's probably something near exponential.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, yes, the timeliness for controlled definitely depends on the probably the dynamic environment of the system. So if it's something that moves very quickly, then the relevance of real time information drops off super rapidly. Whereas if it's a much slower moving machine, that's not the case. So I think it's like proportional to the environment it's operating in. but that's only part of that. That would be the control engineering, like being able to
Mm,
move the system where you need it to go. But for fault detection, all historical information is, I think, equally relevant. I mean, obviously, the stuff that happens right closest to a failure is what you're going to pay most attention to because you're going to start there and work outwards. So figure out what the proximal cause of the failure was. You're going to look at the data that is closest in time to it. But all historical information, like for example, if you have a bearing or a seal wear out um, on a rotating machine, like your assumption shouldn't be initially, and it's very easy to say, well, that seal or bearing must have been faulty, right? We bought it from the manufacturer, it was bad,
right.
that's the failure. But that's almost never the case. It's almost always the case that the bearing housing was coming loose and you had misalignment or
Mm,
something of that nature. So maybe it was a manufacturing work instruction that they didn't torque the bolts on the housing to the right spec, right? And so that whole process of understanding, you know, the time series of all the information you've been logging is what tells you the actual root cause of that failure.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
The five whys, like dynamic. That's a Toyota thing. Is that right?
yeah, I think that's a Toyota like lean manufacturing concept.
Yeah, I remember they were giving an example. I think it was in the lean startup that there was some failure in process, and when you ask enough questions as to why, you get to the root cause, and it's almost never the thing that you assumed it was when you started.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that that kind of is the that process can only be possible if you have records or you have some source truth that you can refer to because just asking the question it's all assumption or guesswork unless you have like a substrate of evidence that you can then point to correlate your assumptions. And that's the problem with modern medicine is that we we have none of that. Like we have what we do is this the gold standard is randomized controlled trials on large numbers of people and the goal is to like test this thing in a closed box, this assumption in a closed box, and then average that assumption across every person, or assume that it applies to every person, and that's substituting for having really good information about every person, every individual, and so I think the underpinning of why we went down this biological observability route is that we intuitively, I think most people intuitively understand that more information about themselves will be helpful in some way, and we're now starting to color in the why that is the case. It is very relevant to complex control systems theory or just monitoring for fault detection, which is going to be it will drive the next wave of targeted, personalized healthcare or health intervention is having an understanding of the state.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because the everyone, especially when you use a glucose monitor for the first time, almost everyone who uses it, same with heart rate, that's been around for much longer, has an intuition that there's something different about this information. And people use the word real time, and that's the kind of true. It's because it's real time that the information is different. But it wasn't until I went on a walk with a friend of mine who works at Datadog, which is a company that uh, you can consider them an observability company. They work on observing very large, complex, distributed computer systems and monitor them for problems. And when I was explaining the problems that we were running into and my own lack of understanding, he said something along the lines of, it sounds a lot like you have an observability problem. Have you read any observability theory? And I had not. And he explained to me that observability is the mathematical dual to control theory. Uh, it's kind of obvious when you say it, but the more observable a system is, the more control you can exert on that system. And it's often neglected because in mechanical systems like a spaceship, it's pretty easy to observe things. You just put more sensors on it. But once you get to the like a further threshold of very complex distributed computer systems, or you basically have to treat it like it's a black box as opposed to a white box, because it's so complex you can't even know the state. When you're getting terabytes, exabytes, petabytes, whatever, some very large amount of information on a daily basis, you can't you now have a like signal to noise problem that you have to figure out. So when I started digging into it, something that was really it was one of the first light bulbs that went off around observability, um, was recognizing that there are fundamental data primitives in observability theory that map pretty closely onto what it is that we're doing. Um, the primitives were metrics, logs, and traces, and it's a little bit wonky going into what those mean, but uh, a metric is the one that's the most easily understandable. Um, we'll sort of use two separate examples. One is in computer systems, which is like when your computer says that your battery is almost empty. You're at 10% battery life, or your memory is 90% full. These are warnings that something about your system is going wrong. It doesn't tell you anything about what caused it. It just tells you that something's off. Um, in a in a biological system like the human body, that would be going and getting your blood tested, or it's like your A1C is 5.8. It's not telling you what caused that. It just tells you that it is a metric that is happening. In people who have a background in computer science or software development will understand what logs and traces are, because they're common parts of the it's a common part of building software. A log is, you can insert logs in the middle of a function that just like it prints something that says this function was called, or whatever you want it to say. You can even say this function was called at this time with this data, and you can follow along and you can see what events are happening. Logs are effectively just events that you're keeping track of. And a trace is something that again, this is something that programmers know very well. A stack trace it's the story. It's basically the connections between those events. It's a linked list. It's the series of events that are tied together that led to some outcome. So it's new information, because how those events are connected is a new piece of information. Um,
And that's chronological time. Those are
Mhm.
linked in time. Yep.
Yeah, they're linked in terms of which one happened in what order, and they're connected. So it's like one triggered another one, which caused another one. Um, the stack traces are super helpful when you're debugging code and you want to figure out like how did this thing just crash. You have your stack trace and you just go back until you find the thing, or like, oh, okay, this is the thing that was wrong, and then you could fix that, and then this problem doesn't happen anymore. Um, the In biological systems, what you want to have is a trace. You want to know, I ate this thing which caused these side effects and these outcomes. I ate oatmeal. I ate oatmeal, which caused me to have this energy crash at 12 o'clock. But the problem is that those two things are so time delayed, you don't necessarily make the connection. It certainly wasn't obvious to me before I started measuring this stuff that oatmeal was such a problem for me, or that things like orange juice were actually just loaded with sugar. So I'd been convinced that orange juice is the healthy thing to have for breakfast.
Hmm.
It's really not. So uh, what you want is a trace. The problem is that you can't generate a trace from metrics. Traces are generated from logs. And when you look at the human body, you can't, in the most abstract way, the way that you would want to generate a log, if you're being very strict on the definition, you'd have to figure out a way to trace each of the molecules from something that you ate through the cellular pathways.
Hmm.
But this is probably impossible, just from like laws
Yeah.
of physics problems.
you need to be in an MRI machine the whole time or something.
Yeah, you'd have to add like, I don't know, radioactive traces to each molecule of a food that you ate.
Hmm.
I don't even know how you would go about that, but uh, and you have to do that for every food that you eat. So,
Right.
yeah, it's probably just impossible. Um, but the intuition that most people have when using something like a glucose monitor or a heart rate monitor that is correct is that the reason why it's different is that uh, technically measuring glucose through a real time glucose monitor, technically that is a metric, but it is a metric that has a sufficiently high sample rate that you can infer events, which are logs. So when you eat something and you're measuring and you see the curve and you have this hyperglycemic spike, that's an event, that's a log. When you have this hypoglycemic crash, that's an event and that's a log. When you start exercising, when you have your heart rate monitor on and you have this increase in heart rate, something triggered that. That's an event. And so there is something to this real time component.
Hmm.
So there, not everything will be useful to track in real time. So this is, I think, where the real time nature gets tricked up. It gets tripped up a little bit when people think about like everything should be measured in real time. Um, there probably aren't that many things that you actually need to measure in real time, but figuring out what those are is going to be an interesting science problem.
Yeah. So, kind of to boil down those somewhat esoteric concepts into just maybe a statement of why this observability theory maps onto why you should measure things is, you know, essentially real-time continuous measurement of the right molecules, not all molecules, but the right ones, can enable us to observe these causes and effects for our health. So, like you said, the breakfast, the walk, each of these has an effect which we can see. That enables, once you know and can isolate cause and effect, that enables control over those outcomes through better decision making, right? And so that is the essential duality of observability and controllability. If you can observe the cause and effect and you know the driver, you can then change it and that can change the outcome. So that is the package deal that is observing the right channels leads to control over those channels. And the tricky part, which is which channels, what do we mean by a channel? It's a probably a molecular or a physiologic um, metric that is happening in a sufficiently high resolution that we can measure it in a meaningful way. So there are things like pulse that happens, 60 to 120 or 180 times per minute. We can measure that pretty consistently, and you can start to derive what's driving pulse changes. Glucose tends to fluctuate within 5 to 10 minute time frames. Um, very very relevant to lifestyle decisions like eating and exercise. There are many, many others like hormones that react to our choices. And that's the domain that we're interested in. It's not so much that we need to be measuring cellular replication, at the at, across all of the tissues in the body or something like that. It's more so we want to be looking at those molecular metrics or derive logs from them which are responding to the choices we're making, because ultimately this is about giving you better control over lifestyle related outcomes that you want to avoid.
Yeah, and like one of my fantasies for the future on how this type of tool will work is if you can measure things like stress hormones. If you can measure things like stress hormones, uh, you can imagine a future world where people who have, say, anxiety and depression. Um, so I've been news sober for almost 9 years now, and I'm convinced that the
Congrats.
news is poison. And I think that for a lot of people, their relentless consumption of current events and news is the reason why they are so anxious and feel so bad all the time. So one of my fantasies for the future is we have a monitor. Uh, there's a sensor that is measuring your stress hormones in real time, and you get an alert. The monitor doesn't even need to know what you were doing. It just needs to say, hey, whatever you were doing at 2 o'clock is physiologically contributing to your anxiety. And that would be the wake up call. Because it's one thing for people, like a friend of mine who used the glucose monitor for the first time was, he's always, he drinks something like 5 cans of soda per day, or at least he used to. And he, he largely thought of himself as invincible, as a lot of men in their 30s do. And he, he started using it. He started using a glucose monitor really just to see what would happen, not expecting to find very much. Discovered that these cans of soda that he was drinking every day were pushing him into numbers that you're not supposed to be able to see as a healthy person. And he texted me within 1 or 2 days after starting and said, my mom always told me that soda is bad, but it wasn't until I saw it in the data that it really clicked for me how bad this is. And I
Mm.
don't think he's had soda since then. It's been many months. So that's the closing the loop. It's like you can tell people, no, the news, it's bad, it's causing you stress. But when you can see it in data, another perfect example of this would be you can read about how caffeine after a certain time affects sleep quality. But what is that number? For me, it's like roughly 12. But sometimes I'll have coffee at 1 or 2. I'm not super strict about it. I don't really notice a difference, but it would be great if I actually could have that information. If I had caffeine after 10 o'clock and it impacted my sleep quality, and I could see it in some metric,
Mhm.
if I could see it in the data, um, that would be incredibly useful. Or the effect of alcohol on sleep quality and other things. Having the data to support it instead of just reading an article and taking it at face value. Not that there isn't value in that, uh, but it makes a huge difference in terms of behavior to actually be able to close the loop.
Yep. Yeah, I think that trace layer of, sitting down and watching the news and then having an indicator, a physiologic response where this sensor system just alerts you to the fact that your cortisol levels are 200% of what they were 35 minutes ago. Uh, you know, Maybe there can be a recommendation involved, do some breathing exercises, go for a walk, something like that. But let's say you don't do those things. You just get that indicator, cortisol is through the roof. And then you try and go to sleep because it's 11 p.m. now, you're all worked up. You try and go to sleep. Turns out you don't get any deep sleep. You're in um, all very light sleep modes. You wake up the next day and you see that your blood sugar is higher, and you see that you get surface like some educational insight around the fact that disturbed sleep leads to insulin resistance. This has been measured in academia. And so you start to see and connect these dots between that news, you know, session that you did last night, elevated cortisol, meaning elevated fight or flight response. Your body's physiologically stimulated. You then don't settle in, you don't get deep sleep. You wake up poorly slept, insulin resistant, and irritable. And you now have a trace connecting all these physiologic moments together and indicating that, you've stated that your goal is to lose weight and be better able, mentally to perform every day. And what's happened here is this chain reaction caused by the nightly news, which ends up positioning you to be at a worse vantage point. And then, a quick recommendation, something like reading a book and then being able to do the same exact night, except instead of sitting down and watching the news, you sit down and you read, a novel for that same hour. And you then get a physiologic update that your cortisol is half of what it was an hour ago, right? Because reading has been shown to reduce stress levels in the body. And so starting to now see that there are actually patterns of behavior that you can select where these traits, which seem like, oh, I'll either watch the news or I'll read a book, it seems like a very flat trade. What's the difference there? Well, it's actually a massive physiologic difference. And people aren't thinking about this because we don't have this logging and tracing yet. And I think, your theory, I totally agree with. I am also news sober now for, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, much less time than you. But I know that I am now interoceptive enough. So I am in tune enough, I think, with my body at this point that I can sense that stimulation when I do read something that triggers me, whether
Yeah,
it's like
same.
scrolling through Twitter or whatever. And so now I think I completely agree with you that this is where the evidence is going to lead us. And we need to be able to give people that personal insight, because it's not enough to say, on average, people are pissed off by the news. It's like, do I have an effect that is negative? That's what you have to show people.
Yeah, and that specifically in terms of the personal effect is uh, I've tried meditation on several different stints, and it's never really stuck for me. I haven't noticed a difference. Um, I tried daily meditation for a month, and maybe it could just be because I'm already a relatively calm person, so I
Mhm.
don't need the meditation to calm me down. Or maybe there is actually a very significant effect, and I just don't really notice it. Um, I would love to have the data to support this. If I could see that actually your effectiveness through the entire rest of the day is improved by 50% from just 10 minutes of meditation in the morning, I would say like, great, I'm doing it every day. Or if for me it just doesn't really make a difference because I don't have that level of stress that some people maybe need meditation in order to help them manage it. I don't know.
Mhm.
I would love to have some feedback mechanism on that.
Right. Yeah, and I think, the human condition is that what you're describing is taking something from faith, from like literally faith based, where I believe that this is going to help me, therefore I will continue
Right.
doing it. Or, sometimes we call that motivation, like just having intrinsic motivation, which gets you out of bed every day to go running in 16-degree weather or to do the meditation for an hour. Most people aren't going to do that. Being able to show evidence that something is improving, even if incrementally, that's a reward path, which, due to evolutionary reasons and many others, that's what we're wired for. We're wired to have feedback on the, because ultimately what we are is we're creatures that have to make selective decisions about where to focus our energies. We have been tuned to follow reward paths, and if you don't have one, if you don't know that the meditation is helping you, then there is no rationale. There's no reason for you to invest in it. And then you look at studies on meditation, and there's this big distribution, and some people have these crazy high quality return on investment, and some people have none, and they average it, and then the results are just the mean. And so there are people on the left side of that bell curve that don't get any benefit from meditation, and that surely shows up in the evidence, and you might be one of those people. But you also might be somebody on the right tail of that you just you can't see the effects. And this is this reward path can be both negative and positive reinforcement. And that's the beauty of data, is that when you have a metric, it's just objective. It doesn't have a there's no judgment involved. It's just a measurement for you. Um, and that, I think, is something that people respond to much differently than the let's see, best practices, right? Best practices can be based on objective data, but they feel very paternalistic. Like, everyone should meditate because it's been shown in evidence or in studies that it provides X benefit. That's very different from your body saying you should meditate. It's doing us very like major favors. You know what I mean? It feels much different than being coached or being uh, spoken down to as someone who should be meditating because that's what the evidence says.
Yeah, and this comes down to the idea of personalization and what personalization means. And I think people often get tripped up in definitions there because the I coincidentally just wrote a memo on this, I think yesterday or the day before, to clarify some of my own thoughts on this. But um, people often think about personalization meaning things like being able to change the background color of your Slack workspace. But that's not personalization. That's not what it means. It's like the best analogy I would give is your doctor gives you personalized recommendations. You come to the doctor with symptoms, and they have enough context of all of the things that they learned in medicine to be able to give you a personal diagnosis. If if you imagine a non-personalized doctor visit, which is obviously absurd, it would be you come to the doctor with a stomach ache, and the doctor says, "Well, the leading cause of death is heart disease, so here's some heart disease medicine."
Right.
Like it's obviously absurd. So you have to have some level of personalization based on your circumstances to be able to make good decisions.
Yeah, So personalization is rather than I think you draw the distinction to customization, which is like not like anyone else's thing. So my car is, has flames on it and other cars don't. That's customization. Personalization is actually I think distinct from generalization. So the personal versus the general solution. So if a doctor is just vending machining out, and actually I would push back a little bit and say we do have this situation where in many cases you may have the 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 subject matter might be personal to your condition. So I have stomach pain, but the response may actually be general from your doctor, which is eat better, work out more. That we kind of get this in medicine all the time because there's insufficient context for the doctor to make very good, targeted interventions. And so when it's not a critical care or acute situation where it's a heart attack or it's a you have some sort of known disease condition with symptoms that can be treated with a known therapy, you do get a general solution because we can't peer into the black box deep enough yet.
Yeah, and this ties into something that you mentioned earlier around in the control context for mechanical systems, the interventional piece. Um, there are two concepts that are useful to semantically distinguish between, which is observability and monitoring. These are these are just arbitrarily differentiated in terms of definition, but observability is around black box systems, and monitoring is about something that you already basically know the answer to. Like you would want to monitor something in your spaceship because if it starts to go off course, you want to correct it. That's not the same thing as observability, even though they are both paying attention to something in real time. They're solving a different type of problem. Um, what's interesting is if you enable better logging in biological systems, basically this concept that we have of biological observability, it also enables monitoring. There are interventional uses for something like this as well. We don't really know what they are, but you can speculate on a lot of them. Like you can imagine if there are conditions where knowing about something in advance is helpful, and if there are molecules that appear in advance, something like a heart attack, maybe it's troponin is something you can measure in advance of a heart attack, or uh, if there are volatile organic compounds you can measure for a pneumonial conversion before it becomes a life-threatening condition.
Mhm.
Um, there are a lot of other types of there are a lot of other types of things that being able to measure them in real time becomes interesting. And we don't have to get into the nuance of like the Bayesian problem of measuring these in large populations, but uh, if they are done with selective populations, then it can really make a big impact even on like traditional healthcare.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think what's interesting there is that you you have a few channels or markers that could be like generally applicable. So, for example, inflammation. So having a high resolution continuous inflammation marker like high sensitivity C reactive protein is one that people have probably heard of before, but this rapidly changes with our inflammatory environment. And for example, COVID right now, one of the first markers to start to climb when you're sick is are inflammatory markers as part of the immune response, and HSCRP is one of them. So if you could, for example, when you're trying to avoid these encounters that might spread, a virus like COVID, being able to see in real time that your inflammatory markers are up, your respiratory rate is up, your heart rate overnight was slightly elevated. It's based on this 95 plus percent probability that you are coming down with something. That's a very, very effective way of understanding your illness condition. But it also could be helpful for detecting infections like blood infections or detecting that pneumonia you were talking about. So there are high leverage molecules that if you can correlate them with other orthogonal indicators like troponin or like cortisol, you can start to, I think, generate really, really high probabilities of certain conditions without necessarily being able to detect, some very specific protein associated with that, diagnosis, but being able to like essentially triangulate a condition based on multiple other signals.
Yeah, totally. this is coming back to the why we need more molecules than just glucose, is that the body is a complex system, and there's not just going to be one stress hormone. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of talk around like cortisol monitoring, and people think it's going to be this panacea solution, and they're going to be disappointed because it's not. Like
Mhm.
if glucose solves 10% of it, maybe adding cortisol, we now can solve 11% of what's actually going on. Like if we're being generous. So the reason, some specific examples of why more than just glucose is needed is like there are so many false positives and false negatives. If you're only measuring one metric, um, the uh, false positives would be things like um, you exercise, you do a CrossFit workout, and you see a big glucose spike. And if that's the only thing that you're paying attention to, you would think like, oh, something bad just happened.
Mhm.
But you know as well as anybody, that's not a bad thing. That's a natural response from your liver dumping glycogen to keep you fueled for intense athletic activity. It's not a bad thing at all. Um, and the false negatives are things like if you pound a liter of fructose, which is way worse for you than glucose, by the way. Uh, Rick Johnson's new book coming out on this, I think, is going to open a lot of people's eyes to it.
Mhm.
Obviously, a lot of Rob Lustig's work on this as well. But uh, you would think that it was perfectly metabolically neutral because you didn't have a response. Uh, so you need to be able to measure more stuff. Otherwise, it's so hard to contextualize all of this with you just have to do it through education in sort of a lazy way when really you want to be able to measure just more molecules.
Yeah, exactly. Like the exercise and glucose example, if you had another marker like insulin, or that would be a holy grail, but you could start to filter for these positive and negative circumstances, because obviously exercise is a very different situation than eating a sugary meal, and the delta is exercise is training insulin sensitivity, or rather insulin independent glucose uptake. So your muscles can use during exercise glucose without insulin being released. Whereas if you eat a giant slice of cake and a big pasta bowl, your body has to use insulin to carry that glucose out of the bloodstream. And so those two things that might look the same on a glucose trace are phenomenally different in terms of the effects on your health. And this is multiplied across many different different pairs of metrics. So what you get is, if relative to multi-signal monitoring, if you have two channels of measurement, you actually get three, because you get each of them individually, and then you get the channel that is how they move relative to each other. So this is the, like, I think, exponential benefit of adding capability, adding multiple signals, is that you can start to, it is similar to GPS, where if you just have one signal from one satellite, you have no idea where on the planet you are. But if you add one more, all of a sudden you know where you are with pinpoint accuracy. Add a third, and it gets even better. So these sorts of triangulation concepts, I think, really apply here, where when you're trying to trace down not just if something changes, but is that change positive or negative? We can use some intuition about this, but adding simply an accelerometer to your wrist so that we know that you were working out when that or when that exercise spike happened, can really dramatically improve our ability to give you feedback. And that will, obviously, as you start to measure molecules rather than just bulk physiologic properties like heart rate, that gets even better.
Yeah, and it reminds me of in a I remember I think it was a podcast that Casey did with Dr. Hyman talking about how he's had some patients where he couldn't something was clearly wrong, but he couldn't if their A1C was normal, fasting glucose was normal, oral glucose tolerance test was normal, but like they also have fatty liver disease. And it can take a lot of probing and testing to try to figure out like why is it that this person's metrics, and then I think they did a fasting insulin and it was super high. It's like
Mm.
that's so weird because usually when people have super high fasting insulin, all these other things are also bad, but in this case it just wasn't. And so this comes down to the personalization component. Like there's something unique about that person's situation that giving them the blanket diagnosis would not have solved this problem. So, uh, yeah, the the multiplicative effect, I think, is absolutely right, which is uh, once you're measuring more molecules, and it's going to be a real challenge for us as the software layer solving these problems is we want to build a tracing layer for biological observability. And the challenge is that the most of these interactions are not necessarily known to science right now.
Right.
And so this is going to require developing new science and understanding of what is the interaction between glucose and uric acid. I who knows? What's the interaction between glucose, uric acid, and beta hydroxybutyrate and triglycerides? How do those react? How do those interplay with each other based on your activity? I don't think anybody knows the answers to these questions, and a big part of it is this is a chicken and egg problem. It's an interesting conversations that I've had with a number of doctors where they say like, well, this you shouldn't do this because we don't know the answer. It's like, well, we don't know because we can't measure it. So if your argument is we shouldn't measure it because we don't know what's going to happen, like then we're never going to know. So
Right.
it's a tricky situation.
It's a bit of circular reasoning. Exactly. We have to develop the capability, the core capability of just measuring these things in order that we can eventually understand what those measurements mean.
Yeah.
And we started somewhere with every single measurement that we have in healthcare. And, there was the first time that somebody measured A1C, and then there was a theory about what it meant. And then over time, it became the standard of care. And we're now transitioning to a point where, due to many different revolutions, you could call them, including the miniaturization of electronics and just better signal processing, we have the raw technical capability to measure lots of things about the individual. It's just that that hasn't been the case historically. So now we've got to kind of push across that hurdle and you open up those channels, and then obviously, like you said, the burden falls on the deconvolution and the signal processing and the interpretation of what all of that means, not just um, in whole, but independent data streams. They all have some modifying effect on each other, and so that's a tremendous challenge, but it's also a tremendous benefit to be able to break it down into the n of one, so that you, the individual, know how your body responds to these choices, and we can determine like the source, the cause, and the effect.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things you mentioned before about the trace of being really stressed before bed, getting poor sleep, being really grumpy. I Something that has always seemed curious to me about the human body is that a lot of systems have corrective mechanisms, and it seems like our bodies are the opposite, where there's like these downward spiral mechanisms where
Mm.
if you get poor sleep, you wake up and you crave sugar. And sugar, of course, you crash later, then your sleep quality is worse. Like
Mm.
it seems like our bodies are intended to spiral out of control.
So uh, I think that there are circumstances that have changed so tremendously that this is possible. I think historically, maybe this was less the case, but um, now you have the ability, like in previous eras of human evolution, like y- the the most sugar you would come across in your entire life is probably a watermelon, and that thing was about the size of a grapefruit back then. It wasn't hybridized into these massive
Yeah.
table size things, and so you'd come across a watermelon and you just gorge yourself because those calories were life or death. Every calorie you come across was life or death back then. You eat anything, it doesn't. Your body just you're tuned to chase down easy, delicious calories, and then all of a sudden, over the course of a few hundred years, well, agriculture started a long time ago, but in the past few hundred years, you now have the ability to, in a single sitting, crush more processed sugar into your body than you would have come across in a lifetime, literally, prehistorically. And so I think that's the situation that we're in now, where these sorts of loops weren't supposed to happen. You can now cause such destruction that your sleep you can't even recover and sleep well. I think that was just outside the bounds of physiologically possible for a long time. And similarly with some of the algorithms we've designed into society, with 24/7, you know, headline news and social media that has algorithms to surface the most reacted to content. These sorts of loops were intended to help us, like we're tuned to respond to threats and listen for gossip to understand what our enemies are doing and things like this. And all of a sudden we have the ability to do this 24/7, and it's destroying, I think, our stress feedback loops. And so yeah, we have unlocked these vicious vortices where we get really stressed out about the news, and then we just want to like binge eat crappy food, and then our bodies don't sleep, and we wake up even less disposed to be able to deal with it. And I think the only way to fight back on it is to, because we don't have sensory feedback loops for this, right? We don't have a mechanism inside that tells us you should probably stop eating that sugar. Like we only have the positive reward of that delicious taste because it was it was life or death. So we have to supplement that to, because we're in this era of technology that can enable this. We also have to supplement with better sensory systems, which can tell you when you don't know.
Yeah, I wonder. You understand the underlying hardware better than I do. Why is measuring stuff so hard in the human body?
um, it's a good question. I think it's the body does a lot to preserve resources, and so it would be awesome if you could like stick something on the outside of the skin and collect sweat and measure all of these molecules in it. But uh, you know, one theory is that the reason measuring, for example, glucose in sweat doesn't actually work is, and the reason for that is that sweat levels and blood levels don't correlate. They they are non-linearly related. The reason for that is likely because if an organism were to leak its primary energy source outside of itself, it would very quickly be eliminated, right? You need to preserve your energy, and so your fuel source can't leak.
Leaking is bad.
Leaking is bad. And so it turns out that the same holds for tears, for any external fluid. Your body does not want to lose these important molecules that are driving it. And this is both fuels, but also hormones that are. It's just inefficient to produce molecules that are then being lost to the environment. So that's why now you have to make something invasive that goes into the tissue and measures it. And your body doesn't like invasive stuff, so it has like very tuned responses to wall off invaders, whether that's a splinter or a sensor. And so that creates disruption where your body will quickly encapsulate the invading sensor probe, and that prevents the concentrations of molecules like in that sort of barrier from being similar to what's in the body at large. And so yeah, there's that, and then there's also just some molecules are very unique. They're small molecules like glucose that have a very unique signature. But then you have bigger like macromolecules like proteins and hormones that are actually just kind of groups of a bunch of other similar building blocks. And so identifying those is really challenging because they're kind of all made of the same stuff. And
Right.
you have to get really, really specific. And they're in very low concentration. So you just like, there's kind of a probabilistic problem where if you have just a very low circulating amount of a certain protein, m- measuring it becomes challenging because even though there might be twice as many of a certain molecule circulating in the blood, that might just mean one molecule close to you. Or there might be half as many, and still there's only one
Right.
molecule close to you. It's just like probabilistically, you can't. You run into this problem where you are. It's difficult to project from the measurement you're taking to the overall concentration in the body. But that's like way in the future when you're measuring very low concentration things. There's a lot that I think can be done that just to be able to measure important molecules that just hasn't been done because for the circular reasoning problem of, well, why would we do it? We haven't ever done it before. Um, you know,
Yeah, and I one of the most encouraging things. I'm sure you saw the announcement. Abbott is, I think this was at CES. Is that right?
yep, the lingo.
Yep. And they're doing glucose, ketones. Do you remember what it was?
Glucose, ketones, lactate, alcohol, or ethanol.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really encouraging step that these companies are taking multi-molecule very seriously. And I wondered, I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about this. Um, what are What are some other molecules that you think would be interesting? It sounds like cortisol would be interesting. What are some other?
Yeah, I think that the top 5 are probably glucose, lactate, um, ketones, or I actually think triglycerides, so like a fat molecule and cortisol, and then probably inflammation, so HSCRP. Those are all in like relatively high physiologic quantities. They should be pretty easily measurable, and they give you such a broad spectrum. So you have like the sugar, you have the fats to help you balance that equation. Because a lot of people, you see a scary glucose spike, and so you start eating like super low quality but high quantities of like fatty foods, and depending on the quality there, you actually could be starting to generate bad triglycerides and cholesterol levels. So you want to balance that, and then having cortisol for stress insight, having an inflammatory marker, and then lactate is a nice, I think, blend of several things. It tells you about the efficiency of your body at processing fuels. Um, that would be, obviously there's a Abbott is targeting kind of half of that range, which is really great. The others like triglycerides and cortisol and HSCRP are a little bit further out, I think, but we're clearly heading in a direction that is really nice. I hope that Abbott will. I think at the CES announcement they were saying that it's going to be four individual sensors. I'm hoping that they will start to multiplex these things, and to me that's just for a convenience factor. I'm already running out of real estate just tracking my sleep and my my blood sugar. So
Yeah.
I think there needs to be a real concerted effort for convenience to drive all of these together and solve the problems. Like it's not going to be easy, but you have to solve those problems if we're ever going to get out of the single mode measurement.
Yeah, I would imagine that's on their roadmap. Uh, I wonder. Trying to think about other. What about something like uric acid? That seems to be certainly David Perlmutter talks a lot about uric acid and its importance.
Yeah, that's something that I need to learn more about. Dr. Perlmutter talks about how so few people understand uric acid unless you've had a bout of gout. And so, yeah, I'm one of those people. I know that there's a strong connection to fructose and metabolic inefficiency. So that could totally be one that ends up emerging as extremely powerful. Like you said, there's no of the range of molecules I just mentioned, there's nothing that would really indicate, maybe triglycerides, but that would really indicate the effects of like a fructose load. And we have high fructose corn syrup in soft drinks and energy drinks, and kids are getting fatty liver disease because they're drinking all of this fructose. It's not going to show up on a glucose curve necessarily. It may show up as increased triglycerides because that's all your liver can do with it. But maybe uric acid can be a much higher gain indicator. So yeah, I think that's something people should be paying attention to who are developing these sensors.
What about was it Rick Johnson or Jerry Schulman who talks about osmolality?
That is Rick Johnson.
What
Mhm.
about because that seems like or blood hydration and electrolyte balance? That seems like a really important thing to keep track of too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Osmolality is something like salt balance within the cells, and that should be one that's really easy to measure. It's should not be a huge challenge. So that feels like low hanging fruit to again add another layer of intelligence around lifestyle choices. So very much, I think my understanding is that osmolality fluctuates with hydration choices, but also salt content and the effects of osmolality fluctuations are conversion of fructose to glucose and vice versa, and so sort of like all of these downstream consequences. So understanding your osmolality balance is, according to Dr. Johnson, something really powerful for lifestyle choices. So yeah, I mean, I think that's another great example. There's the deconvolution of these and like finding the highest gain levers to pull on and to invest in measuring is really interesting. There are lots of discrete studies, but which one to focus on is kind of a bit of a forensic project as well, you
Yeah,
know?
totally. Yeah, and the feasibility of it is because it seems like we don't totally know the concentrations of a lot of these either. So you have to
Right.
figure that out as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host like a body of work to be done on quantifying the interstitial fluid. So because the easiest measurement volume in the body is going to gives you the highest quality information, but is the least invasive, is the interstitial space, um, which is a few millimeters below the skin surface. The problem is that we don't have gold standard metrics for what the concentrations of molecules are and the ranges are in that interstitial space. So there's something to be done here of just like creating the reference data for what happens in the interstitial space for all of these different molecules, which is an exciting body of research that, I think some team has to take on, hint, hint.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that much of this hasn't been done before. Like the glucose monitors we use today are they're measuring interstitial glucose and then trying to software correct it to match blood glucose, which leads to a lot of challenges because those two things, like, although they track the same way, they don't happen at the same time. So that's going to be the case for all molecules. And at some point, I personally think that it makes more sense to just measure what's in the interstitial fluid and display it as such. Like, don't try and software correct it to blood values because actually most of the tissue in your body is exposed to that interstitial fluid, not to the arterial blood values. If that makes sense. So like your blood filters out to the muscle and the brain and all that stuff. And so the interstitial values might actually closer reflect what your body overall is experiencing. And so it might be the thing that you care about more. And so just
Yep.
like circumventing all those technical challenges of correcting it to the blood might not be necessary.
Interesting. Yeah, and more than hint, hint. If somebody listening to this can solve these problems, like let us know, and we might help fund it.
100%. Yeah, it's something that it's the big glaring gap in the research. Is like I've had so many conversations with various teams like in academia and elsewhere who are thinking about measuring things. And they're like, well, we could totally measure this. It's just that we don't know what it's supposed to be, so we wouldn't know if we're right or not. You need something to
Yeah.
compare against, and that just hasn't been done. So if you've done it or if you want to do it, let us help you.
Yeah.